All right, let's jump on into it. So, welcome on in, everyone. My name's Jim Wismer. I'm the director of Ivy Experience. My main role around here is to oversee our standardized testing. I also do a lot of our new client intake and outreach. So, I see in the attendee list here that many of you have spoken to me already. I talk with our families, especially about planning for test prep. And planning for test prep means a lot of things these days, including a consideration of whether a test optional strategy makes the most sense for a student. So this topic of test optional interacts with my day-to-day a lot. I'm joined by my colleague Jordan Holmes, Assistant Director of College Admissions here at Ivy Experience, but also a former admissions officer at Penn, American, and USC. And so Jordan and I are going to be bringing our relative perspectives to the conversation tonight, me as a career test prep professional, apart from my brief stint in academia, and Jordan as a career college admissions professional on both sides of the desk, as we like to say in the business. With that, I'm going to hand it off to Jordan to just provide a little context for the discussion tonight.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. So I'm going to take a step back here. We always like to talk about the 6 things that are in your control during the college process. And we always encourage students to focus on those 6 things because other things, again, you can't necessarily control. On the quantitative side, academic grades and rigor are probably the most important piece of information here. Colleges and universities are looking at your academic trajectory from the very beginning of high school all the way through to the end of the high school. For the most part, ninth grade does count, so make sure that your students are doing well in ninth grade if you have any ninth graders here. But then also fret not, later years always weigh a little bit more heavily in the academic review. The thing that we'll be talking about today as well, standardized tests are still an important part of the academic qualitative part of that application review process. It's just one piece of information in the application. As you're seeing here, you have 5 other things to worry about as well and 5 other factors that are going into that decision too. So again, it's just a piece of information that colleges are looking at. And again, we'll talk about test optional all later today. The college list, of course, is something else you can think about as well, including extracurricular activities, your recommendation letters, and the applications and essays. Those are all things that we can help with here at Ivy Experience, whether it's gym team or the team that I'm on, being the essay side. Again, we're here to help you every step of the way. When we start to talk about standardized tests, maybe for a couple of years ago, especially as the COVID-19 pandemic was hitting, a lot of colleges and universities were going test optional. There was a huge wave of test optional policies coming through from the practical side, but also on the equity side as well, as long as colleges and universities kind of citing that too. As we have moved forward throughout and kind of out of this post-pandemic or into this post-pandemic world, there's certainly a shifting tide of test optional policies, and that we're seeing a lot of institutions not just going back to requiring tests, but also going on the record and saying that these are things that we absolutely want to see in our students, that these are important parts of the application. And these are from deans and directors of admission at schools like Emory University, Brown University, Dartmouth as well. So these institutions and these professionals in the field are really starting to see the value of what it means to have a test score and to use that in their quantitative review process as we move forward.
Yeah, and if I can just point you to the graph in the middle of the page here. Historically speaking, for most of the period through which the NCES, the National Center for Education Statistics, has been tracking the data, high school GPA was the most predictive factor for predicting a student's college GPA, probability of graduating in 4 years, etc. However, test scores have become more predictive than GPA of these things in the past few years. And there's really one reason why, and that is grade inflation. So parents, if you're ever wondering why your kid and all of their friends seem to have much better grades than you, that's because the sort of barometer of what is an A has shifted. So if we look here, back in 1966, about 21.8% of freshmen at four-year colleges had an A plus, or A minus average in high school. As of 2023, which is the last year for which we have a complete data set, that number was 85.8%. Grading is a cultural practice, and it's important to keep that in mind when we talk about admissions, when we talk about high school, because what constitutes A-level work, our opinion of that as a society has just shifted. And that means that more students are getting A's, And that means that GPA is less of a factor that can differentiate students now than ever. It leads not only to grade inflation, but grade compression at the top, because the best GPAs are not so different from middling GPAs anymore. And that means that statistically speaking, the GPA doesn't tell you as much as it has in the past. If we compare this with standardized testing has been historically very constant. I'm showing average ACT scores, and that's because SAT has redesigned its test and its scoring scale multiple times over the past 30, 40 years. So ACT data is a little more steady in that regard because the SAT test has changed. But through this ACT data, you can see that that average score for college freshmen, it fluctuated between 20.6, essentially between 20 and a half and 21 for 30 years. I think my math's right. Always use a calculator when you're taking a standardized test. Even test prep tutors can't do mental math reliably. Even though, I don't know if I'm right or not. I'll check it later. But you can also see on this graph that standardized test scores have taken a recent downturn. And this surprises some people, and it doesn't surprise others. Most people attribute this sort of sinking of standardized test scores to the pandemic and learning loss that we all know happened during that time when teachers didn't have time to adequately prepare for a virtual classroom model, when students had a really tough time with virtual school. Definitely there were gaps there. We see it in our role as test prep tutors all the time. Students who, are in pre-calculus and getting an A, but are randomly, they have gaps in their knowledge of something like percents or fractions that would have been covered in middle school or even late elementary school. And so these standardized test scores, the scoring scale of these is much more consistent than a GPA, which is why colleges have come to, in the past year and a half, kind of change their stance on test optional. So I have here just a partial list of some of the most popular colleges and universities with our students who have announced just since January of this year that they're going back to requiring standardized test scores. Now, I do want to be absolutely clear that the vast majority of colleges are still test optional. You're looking at, writ large, about 80% of schools, 85% of schools still being test optional. And then about, maybe 7 to 10% are back to requiring them. And then you have maybe 5 to 7% that are test blind or don't use the scores at all, mostly located in California. But I just point this out because these colleges have come back full-throatedly endorsing standardized testing as a strong tool in their arsenal to evaluate students and to build the best class for their institution. So one thing that it's important to remember about that 80-85% of colleges that are test optional is that they exist on a spectrum. In other words, test optional means that you can submit a test score or not with your application, and they will still take your application fee and process your application. It doesn't indicate anything to you about how likely you are to get in with or without a test score, which is something we want to cover tonight. So essentially, on this spectrum of test optionality, these middle three policies are all labeled test optional, right? So you might have a college like Duke that admits very few students without a test score. At the last published data, they had 93% of their admitted students submitting scores. And then you have colleges that are test preferred, meaning you will have a stronger application with a test score that college wants to see, a test score that college considers strong. More on that in a moment. And then you have your truly test optional colleges who are admitting, half or even less than half of their students with test scores. And they're saying, you know what, we still believe that we can do just as good of a job admitting students with or without these scores. But the point is that you shouldn't be sort of, how do I put this, lured into assuming that the test score is not important because a college is test optional, because optional is a spectrum. Now, the question, of course, becomes, how do I know how test optional my goal school is, right? And so what we're going to do is a brief tutorial using the old Google machine about how to find this information for yourself. And I'm going to explain kind of some of the parameters around it. Now, certainly the kind of industry knowledge that someone like I or Jordan has from living and breathing this stuff day in and day out is helpful in this regard too. And I'll add some of that kind of color commentary while we look through some examples here. But this is sort of your quick and dirty way to just understand, based on the data, how test optional a college is. And the key here is going to be something we call the common data set. The common data set is a data collection initiative that the vast majority of colleges participate in. Not all, but the vast majority. And the common data set includes information about the freshman class and the application class of a college. They publish standardized testing information about their enrolled students. So this is something to keep in mind. This is not about the applicant pool. It's not even about the admitted applicant pool. It's about the students who actually choose to enroll at that college. So what that means is that it is the best proxy we have for what the colleges accept, but it's not a perfect representation of the admitted students. It's the ones who actually choose to attend. And that can kind of muck up the data in different ways depending on the school. Now, what you want to do is Google the name of your college with the word common data set. Or you can even use the abbreviation CDS. That's what I'm going to use in my tutorial in a moment here. You click through Google to find that common data set for the most recent year available. That data lags. So what we're going to find when we look for this is that really the 2023-2024 school year is the best we can do right now. And that's common. It's the schedule. You know, they're typically releasing at the end of the school year for those freshmen, which means that the data is always behind. You're then going to use your browser's find function. On a PC, that would be Control F. On a Mac, it's Command F. If you're on mobile, usually it's in your kind of browser settings or options menu. And you type the word composite. That's going to bring you right to the page with the test scores. And then there are two things we're going to look at here: the percentage of students who submitted scores and the average score data for that school. So we're going to escape our slideshow view. And we're going to search, let's do the University of Pittsburgh. We are a Philadelphia-based company, even though we work with students all over the country. So University of Pittsburgh, one of our Pennsylvania state schools, is very popular with our students. So we're going to search Pitt CDS, and you can see it's in my Google history because I was practicing. And you can see I already clicked on this link because I was practicing. We go to the most recent year, and every college's common data set page is going to look a little different, but we click that year. We click for the Pittsburgh campus. That's the main campus of the University of Pittsburgh. And here we are in a PDF with lots of data. So I'm on a Mac, Command F pops this little guy up here. And you can see the word composite was already on there from when I was practicing. And it takes us to the test scores. And here we go. So first, we want to scroll up above where that composite is to our submission percentages here. So at the University of Pittsburgh for this class, we see 50% of students submitted test scores. 50% of the students who decided to attend. They'll show you the percentage for SAT and ACT. You add them together. There are a few students who may submit scores for both, but it's typically a negligible number. A lot of students try both tests, but it's rare that you would do equally well on both, that you'd want to share both with the college. Typically, you're only sharing the one that reflects better on you. But that percentage could be, instead of 50, maybe 49 or something like that. The submission percentage is 50. So when we look at what we've historically relied on for test scores, the 25th percentile, the 50th percentile, and the 75th percentile of the scores, what we're really seeing is the 25th, 50th, and 75th percentile of the top 50% of scores from students who were enrolled in the University of Pittsburgh. Because the bottom half of the scorers are the ones who don't submit their scores. If your score was on the stronger side of things, of course, you'd be submitting it. So my advice, as sort of a blanket statement, of course, there's context and institutional priorities to consider, but typically you want to submit your score if it's above this 25th percentile. Remember, it's the 25th percentile of the 50th percentile, which means that it's essentially the 62.5th percentile. because it's sort of above the bottom quarter of the top 50%. And so that means that that score is a strong score relative to the applicant class for the University of Pittsburgh. Historically, or at least during the pandemic, the sort of commonly held wisdom was submit if you're above the median and don't if you're below the median. But many of those colleges that returned to test optional, like Yale, for instance, said in their announcement, like, we saw students hurt themselves more by withholding scores that would have helped them than they helped themselves by not sharing a score that would have hurt them. In other words, Yale actually recommended sending a score that was above its 20th percentile. That's what they officially recommended in their announcement. So they're saying, actually, even if it's a little bit below this 25th percentile, which is just a standard set by the Common Data Set Initiative, that's okay. Please still send it. It will help. So we can see here that at the University of Pittsburgh, if our SAT, reading score is above 640, math is above 630, or our ACT composites above 29, then we would definitely want to submit that. We can also, at the same time, from this 50%, acknowledge that half of the students are being admitted test optional, and a student is going to have a realistic chance of admission without a test score. Jordan's going to talk to us a little bit about what it means to be admitted without a test score and the kind of different ways that they'll weight other factors. But there is a path to the University of Pittsburgh that involves not submitting a test score, and that's important to acknowledge here too. Next, we're going to look at Penn, another popular school amongst our Philadelphia area students, our local Ivy League school. And we will click here. For 2023-2024, you can see every school's common data set looks a little different, but it's in the same structure. My computer remembered I was already in the standardized testing section of the common data set, but you do your same find function. We scroll up, we see 70% of Penn's freshman class submitted testing. And so that means that, Penn is a little less test optional than the University of Pittsburgh. Is there a path to being admitted test optional to the University of Pennsylvania? Yes. 30% of the students do. Now, often colleges are going to be sort of spending those test optional spots, especially at an institution that does clearly value the scores like Penn does, on what we call institutional priorities. Institutional priorities range from, different goals that the schools have about balance of students of different backgrounds, about, for instance, the football team needs a quarterback. That's an institutional priority. The orchestra needs a French horn player. So these institutional priorities come into play and are often where the test optional spots are going at these schools that are less test optional. Now, with our scores here for a university like Penn, you see that essentially the 25th percentile here would dictate that you would really only send a 1500 or above. I believe that that is misguided advice. At the end of the day, what the standardized test score is supposed to do is prove to the admissions committee that you can show up on campus and handle the work, because the standardized test score is the best statistical correlation with the ability to do that. Now, that doesn't mean that it's always true, by the way. In other words, if you're not a good test taker, that doesn't mean that you can't do the work at a competitive college. It just means that by the numbers, most students who have a strong test score can, and most students who don't cannot. It's a blanket statement, not a statement about any individual. And that's really important to keep in mind when we talk about standardized testing, because admissions officers are viewing these scores in context, which is something Jordan can tell you more about. But I would recommend, essentially, if you score over a 1540 on the SAT or a 33 on the ACT, that's a score that you should share everywhere. That reflects well on you. It's a 99th percentile score. So even if it's not as strong as it could be, it's still a score that is going to reflect well on you in this process. So these numbers can be a little misleading for some of the most selective schools in the country, like the Ivy League schools, because a score a little below that, as Yale explicitly said in their announcement, can still be beneficial to your application. So that's important to keep in mind. I next want to look at a very different school. I want to look at Pepperdine, which is a small liberal arts school in California. Pepperdine, I have their common data set right here. And if we look at their Did I spell composite correctly? Sorry, my Zoom controls are in the way of my find function here. You can't see that at home. Okay, here we go. At Pepperdine University in California, 21% of their freshman class submitted test scores. They admitted 79% test optional. And I would say test optional was first a trend among small liberal arts schools. They have believed in it the strongest and the longest. And California and the West Coast, generally speaking, Washington as well, is much more test optional than the rest of the country. So Pepperdine is sort of the intersection of the two groups that believe most strongly that they could, fairly evaluate applicants without a standardized test score. And that's when you see a very strong statement in favor of, applying test optional. Now, another thing you'll notice is that their range of scores is quite wide. Why? Because they only got 160 scores, right? So the data is going to be much more spread out. It's not as tightly clustered and accurate as a large school like the University of Pittsburgh or a very competitive school like the University of Pennsylvania, where only the top scores are making it through typically. So when we're looking at this data, we can see that there's a wide variety of scores that could be an asset on our application to a school like Pepperdine. At the same time, lesson number one here is if you're a student who knows you're applying test optional, for whom even that 1250 is just not on the table for you personally, right? Pepperdine is something as a school where in no way is it going to be held against you that you're applying without a test score. And this is about the most extreme example I could come up with, which is why I used it here. But you'll find, as last I checked, Temple University in Philadelphia, 31% of their admitted students submitted test scores. So you'll find these schools in the Northeast as well, all over the country in different places, because it's about that specific institution's philosophy on standardized testing. So this is your sort of guide to the quick and dirty way to find this data yourself. CDS or Common Data Set is your best friend. Section C, just search for the word composite and you'll find the right data. Now, the thing about test optional, and a couple things you should know. If you're applying test optional, you might be applying to a test optional school that still uses standardized testing for course placement. So the University of Pittsburgh that we looked at, right, about 50% of students submit scores, 50% of students don't. But Pitt requires you to take a placement test for English if you don't have an SAT or ACT English score over a certain threshold. If you take that placement test and don't do well on that, then you're forced to take an extra freshman English class as a graduation requirement. It means you're taking an extra course on your way to graduation. Now, parents who haven't been through this process before, you pay by the credit. So this can hit the bottom line. Now, Vanderbilt has a similar policy, but they don't offer a placement test. So either you have that qualifying SAT or ACT score, or you are forced to take that test. You don't have the placement test option. Now, the idea here is you can be admitted without the scores, but forced to take an extra course, which is, again, another reason you might think, oh, a school as competitive as Vanderbilt, I shouldn't send my 30 in ACT English. But it turns out it can help you when you get there. Now, various other kind of exceptions to test optional, merit scholarships. So colleges that are test optional are often using test scores still for merit scholarships. Last I checked was last spring, but Pepperdine required standardized test scores for their top merit scholarship, even though they are the most test optional school that I could find. So that's important to keep in mind. Not every college requires standardized test score for merit scholarships, but if you're farther out in this process and you're thinking those scholarships are going to be, they're going to have a really big impact on our final decisions on, where we're going to college, then you really want to consider putting the time and effort into standardized testing. It's very common for standardized tests to not be optional for homeschool students. You saw the graph about what happened to school grades since the 60s. Imagine what's happened to mom's grades over that same time period. There are students in certain programs that are not test optional. Carnegie Mellon recently announced they're going back to test required for certain programs and not others. Elon is a popular example. Their nursing program is not test optional. We worked with a senior last year who found that out in August. of senior year. You can imagine the mad dash we had to do to get her ready to take the SAT for Elon. And then finally, some colleges are not test optional if your GPA is below a certain threshold. So that's something to keep in mind as well. These kinds of exception policies, they're not the norm, but well, except for maybe merit scholarships, that is very common. Homeschool students only affects a small portion of the population. But the idea of being test optional for certain GPA ranges or majors and programs, that's relatively rare. So that I don't say this to make you, panic and kind of rethink your entire strategy, but it is something, just make sure you're really reading the testing policy pages of the schools that you're interested in. Now, when we talk about merit scholarships, many universities, and this is especially true of the large southern state schools, they publish online a merit grid, meaning if your GPA is over this and your SAT or ACT score is over this, you get exactly this many thousands of dollars a year in merit-based financial aid. By the way, often these scholarships will accept scores through the spring of senior year. So we've actually worked with seniors who have already been admitted to their school, and now they know, okay, I'm attending this university. I believe it was Southern Methodist was a student we worked with last year. And she said, look, if I get 2 more points on the ACT, I get $10,000 more a year. That's a dream scenario for us in the test prep world when we can basically be your investment bankers. You invest in test prep with us, and hopefully we turn that into $40,000 for you. It's a niche situation. Not every college has a grid like this, but you really should search around to see if you can find them. And if you're interested in large southern state schools, especially, then check it out.
So now that we have all that information and background about test optional, what schools do have it, what schools do not have it, how do you actually decide when to or not to submit your applications, or rather your test scores to an institution? If you've been to any information session or campus tour, you've probably heard an admission officer say this very frustrating line in response to, should I submit my test scores? They'll probably say, and I'm guilty of this as well, back in the day, if you believe it helps your application. And you say, what the heck does that mean? How do I know when this will help my application? Here are some ideas and here are some ways to think about whether to or not to submit your applications with your test scores or without them. It can be really helpful to fill in gaps, so to speak, on your application. If you are, maybe you have a rough year or a rough semester or something like that, and that shows up on your transcript in some lower grades from what your trend normally is, a test score can really showcase that you do know your stuff. You do have a good grasp of some of the concepts that are tested on the SAT or ACT, and again, can make admission officers feel a little bit better knowing that maybe you have a lower grade, but that test score is around their median or around something that's competitive for their institution. Similarly, it can help shore up weak spots. Again, if you do have a situation where maybe in 11th grade, pre-calc didn't go so well for you, it was a new concept, you didn't do well, you and the teacher didn't get along, things like that, and that showed up on your grade. Again, that math score can be really, really helpful to showcase, no, I do know my stuff. I have a 500, 600, 700 something score on my math score to, again, shore up those kind of those weak spots there. As I just gave in an example, that is the most helpful and most concrete for some of those STEM fields as well. It can be the same situation for English, where maybe, again, your AP English class didn't go so well, but you tested well in the ACT or SAT reading or English section. And again, that can be another way to showcase that you do have another way of being good in that specific section. It is worth noting that some schools are also test flexible as well, meaning that they do have the ability to use AP exam scores, for example, or the IB International Baccalaureate exam scores in lieu of the SAT or ACT. And those are even more specific on specific exam topics, right? Like AP English Literature, AP English Language and Composition, those things are ways to shore up those other exams, or those other rather grades on your applications as well.
At my high school, actually, I think it was AB calculus teacher. She was a very hard grader, and it wasn't uncommon for students to leave that class with a B plus, and get a 5 on the AP exam. And that's a way to show to the college, like, look, I performed on this. An AP exam is supposed to show proficiency at an intro college level. Say, like, look, I passed college Calc 1 with flying colors. My teacher decided that was B plus work. And that's the kind of context Jordan is talking about here.
Exactly. And that context really is key because, again, as the admission officer, we don't always know that Mr. or Miss whoever is a really, really tough grader, but we can put the dots together and see, okay, that really strong grade in your AP calculus exam does kind of make up for the fact that, maybe your teacher was a tough grader. Maybe it's something that your counselor will be able to talk about and give the context to just to make sure that everybody's on the same page. But again, that context is key. And as Jim mentioned earlier, if you have that 1450 or above or 33 on the ACT and above, send that everywhere. Because at the very least, as he mentioned with Yale, right, show it that you can hack it. Show that you have achieved a score that suggests that you can do well on campus. Of course, there are other factors that go into that. But again, from their predictive standpoint, the colleges want to make sure that you're going to be able to do well on campus if you have everything else going for you as well. Now, when you do decide to apply test optional to a school, how should you make sure that everything else is good to go? And again, to maximize that application. Both the quantitative and the qualitative factors are going to be important here. And keep in mind that it's not like they're dinging you or colleges are dinging you for not submitting testing. It is more so that you just don't score the points that you would have scored if you had submitted the application. I'm stealing a line from Jim. Thanks, Jim. But you don't lose a basketball game or a football game by having the referees take away points. You just have fewer opportunities to score points. So the SAT and ACT submitting that is an opportunity to score points that if you choose not to submit it, then you just don't have. And that's okay, as long as you score other points, more or less, in other aspects of your application. The qualitative factors, they're absolutely going to look for your academic essays, thinking really strategically and really thoughtfully about why you want to study, what you want to study at that specific institution, and writing those essays either with us on the essay side or with families and friends and counselors and things like that. Really shoring up and having specific reasons for that can be incredibly helpful. Your letters of recommendation are also going to be really great ways to showcase who you are in the classroom and making sure that you're choosing recommenders who like you, which I don't know why I have to keep saying that. I was an admission officer and I just thought that would be a thing that you should do, but choose teachers who like you, but also who can talk to who you are in the classroom and outside the classroom. That context is really important. And again, the academic extracurriculars too, thinking about any sort of clubs or organizations that you're doing, independent research, maybe an internship, anything else that shows how you are as an academic student in or out of the classroom can be really helpful to, again, showcase the other academic points that maybe you're not getting because you're submitting test optional. And on the quantitative side, excellent grades are a must, especially if you're applying early action or early decision and test optional. That means that you have even fewer semesters to showcase on your transcript because you're saying, freshman through junior year, I am 100% confident that this is the best representation of my academic trajectory. If you're confident in that and you feel like you don't need the test score, then absolutely go for it. But really think strategically and deeply about that if test optional is the right way for you, or if you want to have that extra boost by either submitting the test or by waiting to regular decision for that. And as we talked about, AP exam scores became more relevant. Test flexible is helpful. You can always showcase those scores that are really 3s and above. As some of the more highly selective schools, 4s and 5s are going to serve you the best there. So the bottom line, what do we know about test optional? What do we talk about here? Really, a strong test score is still an asset. As again, Jim quoted about Yale, just send the score if it's above the 20th percentile. It's showing that you can still do the work. And again, having a good score is never a bad thing, right? If it's a score above 1450 or 33 on the ACT, absolutely send it because again, you're showing that you can hack it on campus. And again, especially true when you go into the highly selective schools, a 15% or below admission rate. That's even more important to show that, again, you can still do well on campus. And again, if you do have that score, even at schools that are not as highly selective, they can still be a benefit for either merit scholarships, getting you out of certain classes, or waiving certain classes and requirements or things like that as well. Absolutely consider that as an option as you move forward in submitting your test or submitting your applications. And then also keep in mind that if going for that stronger test score is going to tank your grades, stress you out, keep you from doing sports or activities that are really, really meaningful to you, then maybe consider whether the schools you're applying to that are requiring the tests are still a good option. Because as Jim mentioned before at the beginning of this webinar, there are still lots of options out there that are test optional and that are still really great options for students. And so you don't have to stress yourself out in the middle of senior year.
All right, so thanks everyone for sticking in through our presentation. At this point, we're going to go ahead and go through our Q&A. Our first question here is the question that I perhaps answer most frequently in my role talking to the new families who contact us about standardized test prep. Does it matter between SAT and ACT for certain institutions? The answer is categorically no. The only relevant factor in choosing between the SAT and ACT is which one your student can perform more strongly in. So in other words, if you score much stronger, relatively speaking, on an SAT, you should be submitting the SAT. That's better for you. But as colleges don't have a preference for one test or the other, this is a common myth that basically comes about as a result of a historical accident. Because the ACT is based in the Midwest and it became most popular in the Midwest and the Southeast. The SAT is most popular in the Northeast and on the West Coast. If you look at, name your favorite ranking services, top 50, top 100 colleges in the country, the vast majority of them are in the Northeast and on the West Coast and not in the Midwest and the South. Obviously, there are exceptions, but that means that people have had this idea that, oh, well, the SAT is preferred by the more selective colleges. No, it's just an accident of geography because the SAT has historically been more popular in the areas where most of those colleges' students come from. It wasn't so common 50 years ago to travel across the country for college, right? So, and even now, most of these institutions are pulling more from their local area than they do from more disparate areas of the country. So you'll see larger numbers of SAT or ACT submitters, but that's largely an accident of geography and what was going on in previous generations. But colleges don't have a preference. All right. If your child has a high GPA, but the SAT is lower than the average SAT score, do you put in the SAT score? I believe this one came in before our digression into CDS, but our general advice is if it's at or above the 25th percentile, you can feel pretty good about sending that. Okay, question here. I've not been able to find the 2023-2024 CDS for Boston College or Villanova. I can only find 22-23. Am I not searching correctly? Jordan, do you know why that might be?
So I think I actually reached out to Boston College to try and get their updated CDS as well. I think they're just behind, frankly. I think they just have an even bigger lag than some of the other institutions do. This is a voluntary program to have a CDS, so it's not like they actually need to report it to the Department of Education or something like that. So they're probably just behind a little bit. I would try and use that 23 or 22, 23 data just with a grain of salt, kind of get ballpark. And then if something comes out later in the fall, then maybe just use that as kind of the new piece of information.
Yeah, the other thing I'll mention here is if you just shoot us an email, I'd be happy to just do a quick Google tomorrow and see if you are missing something that I might know how to find. It shouldn't take me very long at all. Just shoot us an email at info@myivexperience.com. All right. We got a question with specific details. What about Michigan, a 1420 SAT with an unweighted GPA of 4.0 out of state applying early action? Jordan, what are your thoughts on this one?
My initial thoughts is that everybody gets deferred from Michigan. So if and when your student gets deferred, it is not a personal thing. It is just that they have way too many applicants. They can actually get through in their time. They strategically decide when to submit or when to admit their Michigan students, in-state students. And I think they have gone through some testing and things like that to know that Michigan students are more likely to attend if they are admitted early action. That's a side. On the other side, again, look for that 25th percentile, see if they're within that 25th percentile. And I feel like Jim just looked it up and he has it.
Yeah, so it's 1400. So I would say that the 1420 is a no-brainer to submit, with the caveat that Michigan's another one of those scores that only has the 22-23 CDS up. So if you find more information between now and when you click submit, it might change things. But honestly, a 1420 is a strong score. And with that excellent GPA to back it up, you should be in good shape.
I will also put in my admission officer a caveat of like it is just one of many factors, which is a term that was thrown around a lot last year, that admission officers are considering, right? And thinking about the six things that you can control, those are all the six things that you absolutely can be focusing on. Of course, test score is one of them, but it's not the most important, and it's certainly not the only factor that will be reviewed there.
Yeah, exactly. So when I say you should be good with your GPA and test score, what I mean is that that is a GPA and test score that does the job of the GPA and test score to show that you're academically prepared for the work. It doesn't mean that you're admitted after a holistic review process that involves a whole lot of other factors. How do you know what the school's 20th percentile score is? So for this, I mean, there's no scientific way because none of them share it. So you look at the 25th percentile and you say, if my SAT score is a little bit lower than that, I'll probably still submit it. That's kind of the basic idea. Yale shared theirs voluntarily in a press release when they made this point, but colleges don't generally share it. So there's no like good place where you can find anything but 25th, 50th, 75th percentile in the CDS. Does this apply to GRE and grad school? Jordan, what do you know? Are you at all in the graduate admissions world? We do some GRE prep, so I can kind of explain it from my understanding there. My understanding is that graduate programs are more volatile in their views on standardized testing. So, in other words, either they believe that it's not very valuable at all, more on the Pepperdine end of the spectrum, or they're more on the borderline test required end of the spectrum. My best advice would be to email the programs. Graduate programs have many fewer applicants. So if you email the person who's in charge of a graduate program and share information about your application and ask their opinion on how you should best apply, they will give you an honest and thoughtful answer in most cases. I mean, some college professors are just very bad at checking their email, so you might run into that, but contacting the programs directly is really going to be your best bet for something like that. It's not our direct expertise. GRE prep, yes, for us, but the kind of broader graduate admissions process, we work with students on their essays to optimize those, but we're not as in the weeds of the process as we are with the undergraduate. All right, if the super score is 10 less than the 25th percentile, should we still submit? What if reading, writing is lower than the 25th percentile while math is higher? So I think we can approach this from two different angles. One is if it's 10 SAT points lower than the 25th percentile, that's when you're in that 20th percentile range that we talked about a couple questions ago. In that case, I'd probably still submit it. It might depend a little bit on what the school is. In other words, there are schools where you're more likely to help yourself with a test score versus no test score. And so you might consider thinking about the percentage of students that submit in that case. And if it's 50% or greater, I'd probably be more inclined to submit it. And if it's lower than that, I'm not saying don't submit it, but it's going to be less impactful.
One other thing I will highlight here is about score bands. There's an institution I worked for that divided the entire class and the entire range of SAT scores into bands of similar academic performance on campus. It was about 120 points wide. So basically saying that for example, 1490 and a 1530 perform the same on campus, but a 1530 performed better than a 1310, for example. So that's how some colleges think about it, that it's not so much like, oh, I want to get 10 points higher on my average. It's more so, again, as we talked about in the webinar, academic performance, how well you're going to do on campus, predictability, etc.
Yeah, and I'll note too, there I can skip ahead a question because it's relevant to what Jordan just said. About the new digital SAT. Is it harder to achieve scores at the higher end of the range? The main difference with the new shorter SAT and the coming new shorter ACT is that the scores are more volatile because it's a smaller sample size. And one of the first things you learn in statistics is smaller sample sizes are less reliable, right? Well, if you're trying to draw the same level of conclusion over a smaller sample size, it is more difficult to do. Now, the adaptive nature of the test allows the test to maintain a level of predictive validity that is still makes it very important to colleges, But we are seeing in students' practice and official scores that we expect a wider range of outcomes from our students on any given day. I don't believe that it's any harder to score in that, 1500 plus range. But I do believe that we see more students, who we were predicting at 1450 break 1500, and more students who we were predicting at 1550 fall short of 1500. So that's it's more volatile. And for that, I recommend just plan to test twice up front and possibly 3 times. That's a very typical testing plan. It can make sense to test more than that, but it really is context dependent at that point. If you're testing, more than 4 times, then probably that doesn't make sense anymore. But again, it's context dependent. For instance, if you're applying to the University of Alabama and 10 more points gets you a couple $1,000, yeah, keep testing, right? But outside of those situations where a very well-defined score gets you a very well-defined outcome, it typically doesn't make sense to just keep taking swings like that. But in general, again, higher volatility, not any harder to get at a specific score. Is there a good way of measuring whether a school is a target, reach, or safety when looking at their score in relation to the average? Jordan, you want to handle this one?
Yeah, sure. So we feel like when you're within the middle 50% range between the 25th and the 75th percentile, and importantly, the admission rate is somewhere north of 25 to 30%, that can be a target school. If you're above that 75th percentile, and again, that admission rate is above 30 percentile, or rather is above 30%, it can be a likely school. And then reach schools are anywhere that you're like at or around the 25th percentile for testing, and or the admission rate is below that 30% admit rate. Schools like Hopkins or the Ivy League schools or Stanford or MIT, students may still be within that testing range, but because their admit rates are so low, it is not a likely or a target for anybody. It is a reach for everyone. So again, that admission rate is kind of the biggest factor there, and then where you're falling within that testing range can be a general rough outline as far as whether it's reach likely or target.
Awesome. Thank you. Another question for you, Jordan. Are schools concerned with accepting students who have standardized test score below their 25th percentile in that it would hurt their stats?
Great question. So again, Jim was talking about institutional priorities earlier. And that's something that's absolutely true, right? Thinking about both that concept of there are students that colleges want to prioritize, whether that be local students, whether it be students applying to a certain major, things like that. And then also context, right? The context in which the student is applying from their high school. I'll give an example. I actually covered Pennsylvania when I was at the University of Southern California, and we had access to this really great tool called Landscape, which gave the context of the student's high school with a bunch of really good neighborhood data, but then also really great testing data as well for students who took the SAT. And while a certain score looked not so great within our context, when we looked at the student's context in this one specific situation of a school in Philadelphia, this student was scoring 300 points above the 75th percentile. So while it didn't look impressive to us, she was clearly the best student at that school in that class based on the test scores that we had there. So we acknowledge that high schools are different, especially two schools that are right next to each other in the same neighborhood can still be very, very different. So admission officers are concerned not so much with protecting their scores. Sometimes they'll go for like the 36 ACT because, it's great, right? But at the same time, they want to make sure that they're not acknowledging the work that students have done within their context. So I always say this, and I said this when I was in admission, that if the human elements and those qualitative elements didn't matter, then admission officers wouldn't have a job, right? They would just go and travel and then they'd be done. And there are some schools like that, right? But the human elements of reading the applications, of considering the context, looking at the qualitative and the written pieces, that's where that human element comes in. And that's when test scores do matter, but the context around them matters even more.
Great question. I will add a little more cynically than Jordan that there are some schools out there that are very concerned about their statistics and kind of explicitly game the U.S. News and World Report algorithm, of which standardized test scores are one factor. Northeastern and Tulane, I think, are pretty strong examples of schools that do this, just for representative examples. But I mean, at the end of the day, colleges, what they want to do is admit the best class for their college. And that doesn't usually mean prioritizing an algorithm over the best quality of student that they can get. All right. Does the SAT composite matter more when deciding, or should we consider the reading and math averages or the sub scores? So my advice is, generally speaking, the composite matters more for everyone except for those in certain STEM fields like engineering and computer science, where the math is going to be more heavily weighted. That's kind of my broad answer of that. Jordan, do you have any context or anything to add to that?
No, I think the opposite can be true as well, right? If you're applying to a STEM or rather humanities or English major, it might be nice to have a higher reading score too.
Fair. I would say it's probably more impactful on the math side for those STEM fields, but agreed. All right. Is there info on CDS that shows the percent of acceptance for early decision? Is it
Yes.
in there? Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of data in that CDS. We could probably do a whole nother webinar on just reading that thing. But yes, it is in there, along with acceptance rates, breakdown of men versus women, lots and lots of great data in those. So if you really want to nerd out on college admissions data, the CDS is a great place to go.
Every time I bring it up with one of my students, I preface that I'm the admission nerd and I love it and I can spend as much time in there as I want to. CDS, the AD stuff, or the early decision stuff is like C22 or 23, somewhere down there. Not every school has it, and you have to do some math, but otherwise it's there.
Awesome. Jordan, what is the most important thing when applying to Penn?
I horrifyingly realized that I last worked there almost 10 years ago, which is really hurt me to say. Back in the day, which I would imagine is still the case now, but new dean, new office, who knows? It's the same thing that everybody is also concerned about, right? The top schools are looking for you taking the most challenging classes available to you within your high school context. Again, that word coming up again. Strong test scores, really great essays, everything all together. Each school does have a little bit of a nuance. I'm also a Penn alum, so I loved my time there. And back in the day, they were talking a lot about interdisciplinary studies and thinking about how you don't just think about one field, but seeing cross-field applications and things like that as well. If that's an authentic reason and authentic interest that you or your student has, then go for it, right? Highlight some of that in your application. But otherwise, do everything else that you're doing for every other college, and they'll probably work out the way it's supposed to.
Thank you. All right. I understand the preferences for test scores for highly selective schools. If you chose specifically not to take any tests and focus on STEM-specific extracurriculars, starting your own company, working for tech companies, will the Ivy League level schools that are still test optional seriously consider your application with a 4.0 non-weighted GPA, 4.41 weighted? Jordan, what do you think about that?
Listen, I think as we talked about earlier, talking about the how to maximize your test optional application, you just have to be incredibly confident in the rest of your application. And if you are showing up this way or shoring up your applications rather with these other extracurriculars that are relevant to what you want to study, you're showcasing academic prowess in other parts of your application, then you're doing the best that you can, right? Again, am I the admission officer or an admission officer at that school? Not necessarily, but again, you doing everything that you can short of submitting that test score will only help you in the end, right? So do what you can, choose great recommendation letters, use the additional info section if you want to kind of explain a little bit more about what you're doing, all things that we can help with on the essay side too.
All right. Jordan, do many of the top institutions still use legacy admissions?
It is a dying fad for sure. It is not as prevalent as it was. If a school is going to consider legacy status, then it will probably only be in the early action or early decision rounds. Again, back in the day, I have been sitting in a committee where a student was a legacy and applied a regular decision to the school I was working at, and there was a question mark as to why they applied regular and not early. Does that mean that you have to apply early action or early decision because you're a legacy at that school? No. But back in the day, just giving my anecdotal evidence. It's certainly not as big of a factor now. but it has been something that is that's been discussed in the past.
Thank you. Another question, is it helpful to send a supplemental video, in this case, a guitar solo, since my son is an accomplished jazz guitarist and the jazz band section leader, even though he's not applying to music schools?
Great question. Listen, there are times where I would love to have listened to a guitar solo or a section of music while I'm listening, while I'm reading applications. But frankly, admission officers don't have a ton of extra time to look at supplemental materials, hence kind of why they're supplemental. Even the additional information section that's in the common application that is completely optional for students, but sometimes if they do want to write something, they do. Even that's not really required reading for the admission office. We are like, there were times I was told we fully do not have to look at those things in there. I did for the most part, unless there was another essay in there, in which case I ignored it. To directly answer your question, it can be something that your son mentions in the application. It can be something that they email to the admission office or the admission officer. That's something that I'm advising one of my students to do right now, just to have them have it and have them know that it's there. But including it in the application isn't 100% necessary, only because again, admission officers don't have a ton of extra time to look at extra stuff. But again, that sounds really cool.
Yeah, and I would say, generally speaking, you mentioned your son is an accomplished jazz guitarist. That means that he likely has information in his activities and awards sections of his applications that would accomplish more than a non-music expert listening to him play the guitar without even the ability to judge if it's any good or not. So those awards and external validation that he has in that field is going to matter more than a video of him actually performing to the admissions process. Jordan, dual enrollment versus AP, how do admissions view them in terms of rigor?
Good question. One of the schools I was working at actually equated them, right? It's both college level work. There is a caveat, though, that dual enrollment, to be the most rigorous and to be the most impressive, needs to be taken at the actual institution that's like the community college or a four-year institution, and the student needs to be graded against the other college level students. It can't necessarily be Mrs. Whomever or Mr. Whomever in room 338 teaching multivariable calculus at the college level and that be considered dual enrollment. It needs to be actually enrolled at the other institution. To be most helpful, there needs to be a transcript coming from that other institution as well, just to, again, showcase that there's college level work happening.
Great. Another question here, how do test optional policies relate to the recent affirmative action decision? So I'll answer this by first telling you how I thought they would, and then by telling you what actually happened. So my thought when that lawsuit came out was that it would promote colleges to remain test optional for longer, because essentially if they're being taken to task on their selection process, the more subjectivity they can introduce into the process, right? Test scores are an objective measure. The more sort of cover they have to make whatever decisions they want without being able to be as deeply questioned about them. You think that's fair, Jordan?
I would say so. I think it has been a refreshing kind of wave of seeing what has happened of late because of those policies. I think also colleges have been able to do what they want to, and again, meet those institutional priorities, including test optional, including other factors that they care about, despite what happened last year. So
right. And I will add that the defendant in the most popular lawsuit, Harvard, went right back to requiring test scores, so I was wrong about that. So it's very hard to see from the outside looking in what the real changes are to the actual process. What we know is that they can't use quotas anymore, but how they're actually tweaking their selection process to account for that, it's behind the curtain. All right, so is AI playing a factor in the selection process before a human is reading your essays? And how can you differentiate from AI written essays? Jordan?
I love this question. So when we work with students on the essay side, we preach a lot of personal authenticity, that you don't have to be unique to be like the juggler, underwater, basket weaving, knives, flaming, whatever, right? Like you don't need to do all of that. You just need to be yourself. An AI generated essay, even if it comes to us, is still going to get marked up for students to add their personal authenticity, to tell us the examples, give us the stories, tell us more about it. So that even if it starts off as an AI generated essay, at the end, the student will have done enough work to make it their own, right at the end. On the admission side, I thankfully left admission before AI really took off in this field. But I feel like I would have the same qualms, right? That if an AI generated essay is just this like blanket general essay about this is what my college is experience wants to be, right? I would still have questions as to like, who are you as a student? What do you want to bring to our campus? If it's for a supplemental essay, I don't know why you personally want to be here on this campus studying what you want to study. You just repeated facts to me, which sometimes students don't need AI to do that. At the same time, we really preach personal authenticity. So to us, that's a really easy way to make sure that it still is the student's work later on. And again, even if it does come to us as an AI, we will still say, add more stories, tell us more about you. I know nothing from you here.
Awesome. And I will just throw in a shameless plug on Jordan's behalf that we are still taking some seniors for our essay and application coaching. So if your student is struggling to get their story across in an authentic way that really shows who they are, please reach out. We start with a free initial consultation so you can see if it's the right fit or not. But ultimately, I mean, I haven't seen a convincing AI college essay without massive human intervention to actually add in the salient points. And at that point, it's just a human essay. So, yeah, as Jordan said. So thank you all so much for joining us. Please feel free to book a call with me if you want to learn any more about any of our services, whether it's on the essay and application side or the standardized testing side. I speak with new families about all of these things. We really appreciated the questions. It was very active and lively. It's always fun to give a presentation with a good Q&A. If you have any more personal questions about your student, feel free to email them. And I hope you all have a great night. Take care. Bye-bye.